Carol Ann Duffy, If I Were Dead. She is a Scottish poet. I generally begin my lectures by talking about the age, but I think here I'll talk about the place. That is, I'll talk about Scotland. Some of you might have heard of Robert Burns, who is probably the most popular Scottish poet of the 19th, 20th centuries. Walter Scott, remember, the great novelist, Campbell, etc., are all Scottish writers. You may wonder what the language is. Well, the language is English, but also there is a Scot language, and the traditional one was called Gaelic, Gaelic. It's supposed to have begun somewhere in the 14th century. But it is after World War I that Scotland, the Scottish people, thought it was important for them to have their own identity. And therefore, we look at it as the period of literary renaissance in Scotland. If I Were Dead by Carol Ann Duffy, a contemporary poet, still living. She was born in 1955. She, I must mention, is the first openly lesbian Scottish poet. I'm saying that because she was made poet laureate. But there was so much of discussion and argument among the others who had earlier been poet laureates against this. She had to wait a number of years, but finally, 2009, she was made the poet laureate. She was born in a very poverty-stricken area of Glasgow. She began writing and publishing poetry as early as the age of 15. In fact, she was a popular poet, I must say, because she has been invited to write poems even for public occasions. For example, she's supposed to have written a song called The Rings for Prince William's wedding. Her themes are basically about everyday experiences. She studied in ordinary schools, but could not really cope with that kind of demands that school education demanded from somebody who was poor. But we must remember that as she grew up, she is supposed to have got honorary doctorates from many universities of the world. She wrote poems, plays, and tales too. The title of the poem is If I Were Dead. But you'd be surprised to know that the first line of the poem is If I Was Dead. It's not a grammar class, so I can't really explain to you what difference the use of the verb was instead of were makes. That's another story, but it may be interesting to look at that. So the poem begins, If I was dead or drowned, and my skull a listening shell on the dark ocean bed. Tough, isn't it, to imagine what is going to happen to our body after we are dead? What difference does it make, you might say? But then remember, there is a finality and we do not know what happens after that. So she's thinking first of probably the hardest part of the body, which we all know is the skull. And she thinks of her skull as lying on the ocean bed. And she can hear something. I'm not sure how many of you remember how as kids we would put the shell to our ear and we could hear some sound, and we would say that the sound of the sea has been captured inside the shell. As I grew older, I knew the scientific explanation that it is those curves, those spirals within the shell which causes that sound to come. So here she imagines her skull on the dark ocean bed. As I told you earlier, it is if I was dead and my heart soft mulch for a red, red rose. From the hardest part of the human body, she comes to something which is the seat of love, or so we imagine, the heart. So she imagines that her heart, once she's dead, and from dust thou art, to dust thou go. So it becomes a part of the earth. And what will grow there? What else but the symbol of love, a red, red rose. I imagine, being a Christian, they would be buried after they are dead. But she imagines, or burned, and my body, a fistful of grit, thrown in the face of the wind. Some of us are aware that our great leaders have asked for their ashes to be scattered all over our country, and they've done it from helicopters and planes, or to be washed with the pure waters of the Ganga, etc. Because once it is ash, what do you do with the ashes? I'm talking about the Hindu cremation. So she says, or burned. So if I was cremated, and my body, what would be left of my body after I'm burnt? A fistful of grit thrown in the face of the wind. So I'm scattered all over the country, the world, whatever. If I was dead and my eyes, blind at the roots of flowers, wept into nothing, will be tears. Once I'm gone, will there be tears? She imagines, blind at the roots of flowers, wept into nothing. As you read these 4 verses, what comes to my mind is that she's talking about all the elements, earth, air, water, fire. And then she goes on, I swear your love would raise me out of my grave in my flesh and blood. And if there was someone who loves me, probably I would come back. Like who? And then there's a biblical allusion, like Lazarus, hungry for this and this and this and this, and your loving kiss. Lazarus, of course, is the biblical story of how Jesus raised him 4 days after his death. But here she imagines that is the love of her lover, which will bring her back to life. For this and this, but what is more important, you are still alive, and therefore your living kiss. Is it a reference to the Sleeping Beauty, the princess, who can be woken up with a kiss? Can we come back to life once we are dead? This poem has 7 stanzas, each stanza of 4 lines. There's no rhyme scheme, and it seems as if the poet is repeating herself each time when she says, if I was dead, if I was dead, taking us all the way from drowning to probably cremation. There's no rhyme scheme, and therefore one wonders what makes it a poem. And that is where we talk about the internal rhyme, or we talk about the rhythm. Yes, of course, there is an allusion when she talks about Lazarus, but otherwise it is a simple poem. I grew up in a world, the post-colonial world, born soon after independence. And when I thought of English poetry, I only thought of poetry that came from England. England to me then was Great Britain, UK, all rolled into one. But when I read a poet like this, a poem like this, and I know that it is a Scottish poem, I want to look at it differently. I want to see how the experiences of a Scotsman is different from an Englishman, which is probably different from an Irishman or a Welshman. And that's where I would like to compare it with Indian writing in English, because remember, we have an entire body of work coming out of India and the other colonies today.